Hello everyone, welcome back. We're here on a Sunday again, back to business as usual. Let's pop this up. This is the address where you can get today's soundtrack at the end. scientificsounds.com/esoteric anatomy part 2. There will probably be a few of these because anatomy is vast and amazing and connects to the cosmos and all that. Scientific Sounds ask a question. For any question you have regarding anything we've covered in these live streams or anything at all, questions, comments, this is where you go to see all the live streams I've done since the beginning. This is my YouTube channel. Just pay attention. Dr. Thompson Live. The D, T, and L are capitalized. So, the taking on the idea of the anatomy and the physiology of what's here is such an unbelievably vast task that's constantly changing and constantly evolving. Like I said last time, they've discovered 3 new organs. They discovered that the brain itself actually has its own immune system. Now, when I went to school, and for decades, I was at school 45 years ago, so that was before the biome was discovered. And certainly at that time in neurophysiology and neuroanatomy, it was recognized that the brain was the single exception in the body to the immune response, that the brain had no immune system. It was closed off from the normal immune response through the blood-brain barrier. Specialized sections of blood vessels with hyper-tight connections, not semi-permeable, where things can freely flow back and forth in and out of the blood vessel wall. The blood-brain barrier is tight connections and nothing passes through except what the brain tells can pass through. Only very specific things can pass through, the nutrients and certain types of proteins. But then they discovered, no, that's not true. That's not true at all. There is a way in which the brain is connected through the immune system. We'll cover that one as well as other things. We will discuss, not today, but the additional organ systems that have been discovered, like the mesentery. But, along with that, when we look at this total organization of how the nervous system is put together, like this sort of wiring diagram, brain, pons medulla, cerebellum, brainstem, nerve roots coming out. This picture right here is only illustrating the major nerve root connections that come out of the spinal cord that go out into the body and into the muscles and joints and send all kinds of information back to the brain, into this area right here, by the way. That's for vibration sense, and for sensory information comes back into the post-central gyrus. Because like I said before this, there's a big sulcus right here, a huge valley, divides the brain in half, front to back. So this is the sensory cortex, the post-central gyrus. Precentral gyrus is the motor cortex, where signals come out of the brain into the body. But this is receiving everything, pain and vibration and heat and cold and all that kind of information. But as you can see, things are spread throughout the cortex in very specific locations. And all the different locations where things are put or processed are all bound together in a wireless brain connection, sort of an internet of the brain, all bound together with gamma brain activity, as I discussed before, where gamma modulates theta brain activity and lifts it right out of the brain and gathers all these separate different types of sense information into one spot. So it's kind of synchronized up together. And then we also discussed the master control system, the hypothalamus. Really, this is the number one area in the body that coordinates and controls, receives signals and sends signals back out, organs and glands and different systems in the body. It controls, let's go back here, sorry. It controls the pituitary gland, which is here, and has the different nuclei in here. The anterior nucleus, this one here, is the center of the parasympathetic nervous system, and the posterior nucleus is the sympathetic nervous system. And each one of these little organelles has some duty. Here's the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's this one. That's the center of the body clocks. This is also the center for brain entrainment. Brain entrainment happens because our body is trying to time itself to external pulses in the world in order to save energy. And we can commandeer that with brain entrainment to force the body to follow our cues, our sound pulses pulsing at a brainwave speed. But the two master control systems in the body is neurological and biochemical. Neurological, brain, spinal cord, nerve roots, autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, the neurological portion. And the other portion is the biochemistry portion. All the biochemistry that makes all these systems run. Because the fuel for all of these systems here in the autonomic nervous system is biochemical fuel produced by the organs that this system controls. So if it goes too far haywire, then the manufacturing plants in the organs that these systems control become so deficient that they're not producing the biochemical fuel that this system needs to run properly. So we end up in a vicious feedback loop that's negative, where this can't function normally at a certain point when the biochemistry is too screwed up. And this system controls the biochemistry as well by controlling the organs and glands. And it does that through controlling this pituitary gland, which has an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. One is a neurological lobe and one is a biochemical lobe. So this is where those two master systems come together here in the pituitary gland. And you can see the pituitary is here sitting in this floor cranial bone. This cranial bone that forms the base and the floor of the skull. And you can see that there's this pocket, a bony pocket that the pituitary is encased in here. Here's the pocket. This bone pocket is where the pituitary hangs inside this pocket. And that pocket, by the way, is, as I showed once before, with my skull here. So as I said before, this is the real thing. This is an actual bone skull. I bought this way back when I was in school in the late 70s. And now they don't sell these anymore. You can't buy a bone skull anymore. It's all plastic now. So this is a rare thing. This is a very valuable thing I've got here. an actual, true, real human skull. And so we can take the top off that skull and inside the skull we can see that pocket. It's right there. Where my finger is sticking in, that little spot there, that is where the pituitary sits, right inside that pocket. This thing is called the sella turcica. It looks like a Turkish saddle. That's what that means. Turkish saddle, sella turcica. And of course, if I turn this around this way, these structures here that come across on either side that look like bat wings, this whole bone is called the sphenoid bone, with the sella turcica in the middle of it. And these areas, the temporal bones, is where the cochlea of the inner ear is located on both sides, and where the semicircular canals are. And on the outside of this temporal bone is the ear and the TMJ. There's the joint that comes around like that. So that's what this sella turcica is right here. And it means that the normal cranial bone motion between the frontal bone up here and the occipital bone at the back, with the sphenoid bone in between the two, act like a double hinged threesome kind of cranial bone motion, where the sphenoid is here and the occiput is here and the frontal bone is on this side. And as the occiput and frontal bone rotate, the sphenoid bone rocks back and forth in between, and the sella turcica that's here with the pituitary hanging in it is pulled back and forth subtly, literally a physical milking of the pituitary gland to activate it kinesthetically. And what it's producing is a whole range of hormones, and those hormones are specific for the endocrine glands underneath. As we discussed when we talked about the chakras, I did 3 live streams on the chakras and explained that idea in detail. The 5 chakras below the neck are different than the 2 up above, reflected in the ancient diagrams of the number of petals per chakra: 4, 6, 10, 12, 16, and then 96 and 960. So that's 10 times higher, more petals, and 10 times more petals. And you see that reflected in the function of those glands. All of the endocrine glands below the neck are called the ductless glands. No duct, no tube. The hormones they produce are infused right into blood vessels that network through the gland. So there's an instant access to the blood. When the gland produces this powerful hormone, like adrenaline, immediately your heart races and blood pressure goes up. And the pituitary gland is also an endocrine gland, but it doesn't produce 1 or maybe 2 hormones that have this instant effect on the body. It produces a whole range of hormones that have no effect on the body. Their effect is on the targeted endocrine glands. So this really is the conductor, and this is the orchestra. Big difference. And the pineal gland, in relation to the pituitary, or this chakra compared to this one, is also 10 times more different, because the pineal gland is the only gland, it produces one hormone, melatonin, and it's the only gland that doesn't produce it into the blood like all the rest. It produces it in the cerebral spinal fluid because it's housed inside one of the ventricles, surrounded by cerebral spinal fluid, so its hormone doesn't affect the blood at all. It affects the cerebral spinal fluid, and that circulates around the brain and the nervous system and out the nerve roots. And so really what the melatonin is doing is charging up the brain, because cerebral spinal fluid is an electrolyte, which makes all the brain firings 10 times more efficient, which is why cranial respiratory motion that pumps it around is important, particularly the younger you are as a child. When neurodevelopment and pathways are being burned, we need to be bathing those neurons with this electrolytic solution so that the brain is hyper-functioning at the point when it's doing its most intensive growth phase. And that's where we end up with children with neurological developmental problems, learning disabilities, delayed speech, delayed walking, autism, ADD, ADHD, dyslexia. All of those conditions have a possibility of a component being a difficulty in the birthing process that did not initiate the cranial pump and the craniosacral pump. For instance, a C-section or a forceps delivery prevent the skull from being squeezed and pop open to begin that process. My specialty, children and neurological conditions, and a good portion of those children began the process as a C-section or a difficult birth process, a non-normal birth process, forceps or something. And I've been dealing with kids with ADD and ADHD and dyslexia and autism and epilepsy and all of those learning disabilities and delayed this and delayed that throughout my whole career. I mean, right from the beginning, that was pretty much what I was really good at with kids. And in all those years, I would say the majority of those kids, almost 90% of those kids, have a vaccine injury story, neurotoxin story, aluminum, mercury, polysorbate 80, normal kid until they had their shots banked, then they're within an hour, within 2 hours, within a day, they are no longer normal, no longer developing properly. And so that began me researching and questioning the railroading of vaccines. 78 vaccine shots by the time you're 2. And in tracing that out through guidance physiology and Gray's Anatomy, and now the new book that I just got, I just bought this book, Principles of Neuroscience, and I didn't realize it was this thick, but good God. This is the ultimate Bible of neurology. This has got diagrams, the level of detail that I've been now looking for a long time. A level of detail that shows the kind of answers to the questions that I've been asking, and couldn't find it in normal text. Even Gray's Anatomy doesn't have it. So you need a neurology Gray's Anatomy, only for neurology to tell. And of course, that's where you see that the only thing that protects the brain from these neurotoxins is the blood-brain barrier. And the blood-brain barrier doesn't form completely until age 2. And by the time you're age 2, you've had 78 shots with aluminum and mercury. So this is not a good thing. And statistics are working against you, because there will always be 80% that respond and 20% that have a problem. And 2% of that 20% will have fatal problems or severe problems. Anyway, neurological and biochemical come together here, controlled by the sympathetic, parasympathetic here. And as I said before, the sympathetic comes out of spinal nerve roots from the first thoracic down to the third lumbar, out through what's called the sympathetic chain, out the other side into postganglionic neurons, and then out from there into the organs. But the vagus nerve, which controls the parasympathetic, it comes straight out of the brain. It's a cranial nerve, so it flows straight out of the brain and directly to the organs. So that's the fastest transmission, and obviously the vagus nerve is the one that controls the system, because there's so many stopovers as these signals from the sympathetic finally get to the organs, that this is a much faster, and therefore this one controls it. The vagus nerve here and the sacral plexus, there are collateral branches that connect these two together. I said before, the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve are tied up together closely to the point where the glossopharyngeal nerve is recognized as a co-neuron of control of the parasympathetic response. And glossopharyngeal, tongue, and pharynx controls how I make sound in my voice box. So it's full circle with chant and voice, its ability of vibration from my vocal cords to directly influence the neurons of control of my organs and glands and my whole master control system of my body. And that's confirmed. The first thing I did was confirm that here. So this is the Bible of neurology, and in here it states unequivocally that the glossopharyngeal nerve is a second neuron of control of the parasympathetic nervous system, which drives the system and controls it. So I laid that to rest once and for all. It's no longer a question, which gives new significance to the role of vibration and sound in direct access and control of the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic. As I said before, the glossopharyngeal nerve is also the civilization neuron. It's the overriding neuron that overrides a knee-jerk response to attack, or you look at my girlfriend and you die, kind of a thing. So here's a little picture of where the vagus nerve comes out, innervates all these organs, and also ties itself together in a network with the sacral plexus. So this really is all one connected up thing. Where you can see it comes out and innervates all these different organs and glands. And now we see, article after article, research report after research report in major medical magazines and research institutes that tapping the nervous system to treat, say, Crohn's disease, which is an autoimmune disease of the gut, vagus nerve stimulation is being used to treat epilepsy, depression, cluster headaches. Now researchers are testing whether it can be used to help people with Crohn's disease, the brain-gut connection. So for me, it's a sort of frustrating / gratifying experience to see that major medical and major research institutes across the world are finally recognizing the importance of the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system as the ultimate cause of disease. That's what I've been preaching now for 40 years and been actively doing in my practice. And what the biotuning thing is all about, using sound waves to affect the autonomic nervous system to balance the body's systems from the inside out. So the real doctor is awakened up, and I'm not playing doctor out here anymore, so to speak. But this alludes to the ability of the brain to affect the gut and the gut to affect the brain, and is the newest cutting edge of research into the brain-gut connection. PubMed, the El Primo medical publishing company in the world, connected with NIH, the National Library of Medicine. Vagus nerve as modulator of the brain-gut axis in psychiatric and inflammatory disorders. So they're talking about influencing the vagus nerve for psychiatric conditions. And if you've been watching these live streams, that's just what I've been talking about. The ability of that when the vagus nerve is calling the system into a fight or flight response, because the parasympathetic turns off and the sympathetic turns on by default. That means I'm running this fight or flight response all the time and I can't get out of it. I'm stuck in there. That equals all kinds of physical problems to take place and psychiatric problems to take place. And now we know that's linked with certain brain states, different organizational dysfunctions of how the brain works. Gamma activity deficiency leads to certain symptoms. Default mode network is more and more and more important in neuroscience, in psychiatric conditions. Epilepsy, schizophrenia, dissociative disorders, bipolar disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders. All of these things are coming from disorganizations in the cortex, and all of those are happening because there's a disintegration of communication between the hemispheres and different pathways in the brain, and that's closely associated with default mode network function, which is controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system. So, stimulation of the vagus nerve to rebalance the autonomic nervous system to treat psychiatric disorders all of a sudden makes a lot of sense. And now there's books coming out. Vagus nerve healing, improve your immune system, overcome brain fog, inflammations, digestive disorders with self-help exercises for the vagus nerve stimulation, help for anxiety and depression. And what they're saying there is, pretty sort of laughable. The self-help vagus nerve healing, vagus nerve governs the relaxation response. So anything I do to relax is stimulation of the vagus nerve, which this book is kind of talking about. So basically it's going to say something like, take a nice hot bath with herbs in it and light some candles and hug somebody because that stimulates the vagus nerve, and pet a cat and meditate. Go for a walk in nature. Those are obvious. Those are the things that have stood the test of time of relaxing. The unfortunate thing is those simple techniques become less and less and less effective the more the 21st century societies that we have artificially built become more stressful and stressful and stressful. So at this point, the 21st century is such an unimaginably stressful place to be in ways that we can't even know, that we don't realize up here. Electromagnetic frequency pollution from the wiring in your walls, your electronic equipment, your computer, your cell phone, the smart meters, electromagnetic influences in the brain and central nervous system are responding to that. I'm trying to dance to a partner that's not dancing back, and it's emptying me out, stressing me out. As soon as I walk outside, I've got 5,000 radio channels and television channels and broadcast frequencies and shortwave 1 and 2 and military frequencies and microwaves and cell phone towers, and now it's 5G. So and that's not even talking about chemical pollutions, fumes coming out of your carpets and out of the tailpipes of all the cars and traffic jams. And I mean, it's this thing. It's this unimaginable marathon of stresses the body was never designed for. And the simple little techniques of taking walks in the woods and sitting down on your butt and meditating for an hour and petting your cat just don't cut the mustard anymore. The onslaught is too intense, and it's too pervasive, it's too constant for those simple techniques to battle that. You need high-tech intervention. You need something that can meet that 21st century unimaginable stress challenge. And that's where we're using precisely tuned sound waves with medical monitors to balance the autonomic nervous system and force it back and break that vicious cycle, and then exercise this up in a gym in a sort of high-tech meditation, high-tech feel-good, which I think is the only thing that has the power to challenge the 21st century of stresses and make headway there. Frontiers of neuroscience. Anti-inflammatory effects of abdominal vagus nerve stimulation on experimental intestinal inflammation. This is talking about gut problems, Crohn's disease, things like that, irritable bowel syndrome. All of those sort of conditions with vagus nerve stimulation again. And when we're talking about medical version of vagus nerve stimulation, we're talking about implanting electrodes, wrapping those electrodes around the vagus nerve, and implanting some kind of electronic pacemaker to stimulate the vagus nerve. And that is the typical medical approach. That's the way they think. We have to penetrate, we have to cut, we have to implant something artificial, some electrical influence thing, when in reality you can do it with sound waves through a sound table. You can do it with headphones. I mean, that's what I've been doing for 40 years. So it becomes frustrating to see the medical system's approach, which is expensive, it's intervention, there's possibility of things going wrong, and there's just practically zero downside for sound waves in headphones or through a sound table. But there's not as much bucks to be made, and insurance to pay. Parkinson's. Progressive symptom reduction strategies for Parkinson's using vagus nerve stimulation. This is a whole blog that has to do with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, an autoimmune disease of the thyroid. Vagus nerve as modulator of the brain-gut axis in psychiatric and inflammatory disorders. The role of the vagus nerve by inflammatory and immune disorders. Interaction between the gut and the brain is based on a complex system that includes neural but also endocrine, immune, and humoral links, which is, once again, neurological and biochemical links between the brain and the gut. But as I said before, the shaking in Parkinson's completely disappears on the sound table with your primary frequency. It just goes away completely. So that means that, and it only works with the vibration, doesn't work with headphones, only the vibrations. So there's something about the vibration network in the posterior cord that goes right up through the brainstem, through the substantia nigra, where Parkinson's takes place, and stimulates that somehow to release the missing or deficient hormone, the dopamine, and all shaking stops. So that's currently part of our cutting-edge research at CNR to see if we can create a wearable device throughout the day to stop the shaking, and see if over time that actually starts to improve the condition. But as I said before, so we've got this other system here of endocrine glands, and these endocrine glands have direct correspondence with the 7 chakras, gonads and pancreas and adrenals and heart and thymus and thyroid. The heart chakra for decades was just thought to be actually the thymus. The thymus is an endocrine gland, and all the chakras have to do with endocrine gland connections. The heart being a muscle that pumps blood and not an endocrine gland, so we sort of all thought, well, it shouldn't be the heart chakra, it should be the thymus chakra. But in reality, 15, 17, 18 years ago, they discovered that the heart actually produces hormones, so it was reclassified as an endocrine gland. More mind-boggling, right? So it really is the heart chakra. It's the heart-thymus chakra. And then the pituitary and the pineal gland as the top 2, linked heavily into this other subtle energy vortex, energy system of the chakras, where each of these chakras is rooted in physicality. These are subtle energy vortexes to the metaphysical world, who are linked directly into physical endocrine glands associated with each one of these. And the endocrine glands are all linked directly into the pituitary, which is controlled by the hypothalamus, and the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic parasympathetic is the ultimate control of this as well. There is an acupuncture point linked with each of these, and the acupuncture meridians are linked also into all of these glands. So there's both a neurological connection to an endocrine gland and an acupuncture connection through the meridian that controls that endocrine gland. So all of these systems are closely networked together. It means there's an acupuncture point for each of these chakras as well. And of course, the chakras are so much more dense and complex than the simple 7. There's harmonic chakras that spin out of the top of the crown chakra. We sort of touched on that a bit when we talked about the chakras. And this chart from India that showed supplemental chakras at every joint, shoulders and elbows and wrists and center of the palms of your hand and knees, and all of them having exotic electromagnetic field connections with each other and with the main chakras, forming an electrobiomagnetic field that extends out into subtle energy realms. This chart is the real sort of esoteric anatomy idea, where physicality, where endocrine glands physically tap into non-physical energy systems. And these non-physical energy systems link straight into specific spinal levels, spinal nerve root levels, postganglionic plexuses associated with each chakra, linked directly into the vagus nerve and the autonomic nervous system and the pituitary system, which is this brow chakra. So the complexity of these meridians as well. You know, we see mostly charts of these lines going up and down the arms and the legs and the body that show the flow of ions, electromagnetic energy, which the ancients called chi. It's really electromagnetic, and you can measure it with a skin resistance meter. You can measure each point and see if it's active or not. But each of these channels goes deep inside the body and has an inner channel network that goes to various organs associated with that meridian. So when you see the ancient Chinese texts on the meridians, you'll see that the meridian actually goes down deep inside the body and has other channels that you normally don't see in these surface charts. But the medical level of acupuncture, you see those inner lines of force that's connecting to various organs, going inside the body and coming out at other places. But all of those connect us with this ethereal realm. And as I said before, all of it is micro and macro connected together. What's going on in my brain is reflected in sort of a brain network in the cosmos. We see the same kind of axon connection nodules and plexuses in the cosmos at large, except they're hundreds of thousands of light years long, and they have galaxies and nebulas on strings that connect, just like neuron connections with axons in the cosmos. And that brings us into the math of the cosmos that is reflecting itself in miniature in the body, in what they used to call, or what they still call, sacred mathematics, sacred geometries, golden section ratio, repeated everywhere, in the shapes of my body, in the shapes of my face. The concept of beauty is completely based on proportions of the face that most closely follow golden section ratio proportions. The distance of the center of the bridge of the nose to the inner corner of the eye, to the outer corner of the eye, to the outer of the face, 1.618, 1.618. The more perfect that aligns, the more beautiful a person is said to be. And this extends throughout the proportions of your whole body. That's what Michelangelo and the statue of David was all about. These proportionate ratios, which also align very closely to a tone and its harmonic fifth, 1.618, or close to that. And so really what we're seeing is music proportions in the body and in the face and in the cosmos and in nature, governing the rules of math and proportions and geometry, linked with music theory. Why a chord sounds good, why certain notes in a chord are pleasing, because they reiterate the mathematics of the proportions that your own deep unconscious mind used to fashion your body and nature and the cosmos. And these pictures in the back, these are, the lines that form in sand. With every frequency forms its own pattern. So these patterns are mathematically related based on these same laws. It all hangs together. And then, not to be missed, is the fact that, we are a conglomeration. My body might look like a solid thing from a quantum physics standpoint. We know that's not true. We know it's mostly space and resonance, standing waves. But 4.5 billion years ago, when the Earth was still forming, and we had the first, primordial soup pools, and the first bacteria started to arise, the first living beings. And at some point, when the bacteria are fighting each other for the food morsels, something happened. And nobody knows what, but something happened, and a grand new idea arose out of living creatures in the primordial ooze that realized that cooperation is better than competition for survival. And so these symbiotic relationships began to emerge between different types of bacteria that would bind together, because I could do this really well and you do that poorly, but you do this really well and I do that poorly. So if we bind together, we've got a better survival outcome. And that idea continued and became more complex, and then created multicellular organisms that began to arise in the ocean, and they came out on land, and pretty soon they became you and me. multicellular organism, massive levels of symbiotic relationships. And the first one that I studied in school was the mitochondria. Inside every cell of your body, there's all these little organelles, and this one, the powerhouse of the cell, which is the key to ATP, the adenine triphosphate, the basic unit of energy of the cell, which is the basic unit of energy of being alive as a multicellular organism. But, the mitochondria is not us. Mitochondria is a separate creature with separate DNA. It's a symbiote. There's a symbiotic relationship between our cell creating an environment where the mitochondria can exist, and the mitochondria creating the energy that the cell requires to exist to create that environment. So it's this beautiful yin and yang thing. And this has been going on for millions of years. A stable symbiotic relationship between our cells and the mitochondria that populate them. And depending on what kind of cell it is, like a heart cell, we'll have thousands or tens of thousands of mitochondria per cell. And that means that there's more of them than there is us. That what I consider myself to be with my cell networks making my body, there is more alien creatures with different DNA than there are my own cells, which brings into question, perhaps I'm not what I thought I was, that perhaps my body is the host and the foreign entities with the other DNA, where there's more of them than me, they're the ones who's talking to you now. And my body with its cells is just the horse that the mitochondria is riding or something. And it gets more crazy than that, because now the big discovery is the biome. Our gut populated with 25,000 different types of bacteria that all are compartmentalized into different specific duties. 39 trillion bacteria exist all over our body, not just the gut. They live in our skin, they live in our hair follicles, they live in our eyelashes. We're crawling with creatures, all in symbiotic relationships with each other. We are a multi-creature entity. And who we think we are, with our own cellular makeup that makes our skin and our organs and our cells, is the minority, actually. The ratio is 1.3 to 1. There's 1.3 more of them than there is us. There's 39 trillion bacteria all over our body, and there's only 30 trillion of us. 39 of them, 30 of us. We're the minority. And the bacteria that are in the gut, this is really another frontier area of biological science in the last 10 to 15 years, and it's getting more intense all the time. The more we study these bacteria in the gut, the more intense it gets. They produce all kinds of neurochemical activating hormones. They produce dopamine and histamine and acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter for brain cells. Tryptophan, which is the precursor of serotonin, and melatonin in the pineal gland, produced here in the gut, and transmitted to the brain by the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve that comes out and it wanders around and goes to all the organs and glands, it has huge connections that go into the gut. And research that I saw just a couple of years ago, that kind of blew my mind, where not only is the vagus nerve monitoring the bacteria in the gut, but it's also communicating with them. There's a dialogue going on. It's not just that we've got foreign creatures that are populating our gut and they're kind of down there doing their own thing. No. It's tightly, succinctly coordinated with the brain and the brain in your gut, which is all these 25,000 biome bacteria in all kinds of different population groups for specific duties. And one of those population groups produces electrical impulses like brain waves in your gut and communicates those electrical impulses straight into the vagus nerve, which transmits directly to the brain. So they're actually talking with neuro impulses. We are communicating with alien species in our gut, talking all the time and coordinating our immune response and coordinating the manufacture of neurochemical hormones that control behavior and control emotions and co-control the autonomic nervous system, which is telling everybody what to do. It's mind-boggling. Where previously we thought this was the big guy, this was the one that controls everything, but now we're seeing that the gut is another brain made of cells of alien creatures with different DNA. So it's another yin-yang. There's us and our cells, and there's the gut populated with alien creatures with different DNA. Us and them working together closely, married as a couple, a symbiotic relationship that works and has been working for millions of years. And this little guy, I mean, the brain, for God's sake, 3 pounds, quantum computer, 60% fat, 80% water. It's not completely developed. You know, the brain doesn't finalize its complete development until you're 25 years old, which is essentially the end of the growth phase for your organism. After 25 years old, all development has taken place throughout your body. And from that point on, you're essentially level for a while, then you start going downhill, aging. 86 billion neurons in this quantum computer here. 1,000 trillion axon connections. That's 1 quadrillion connections between brain cells. And remember, Einstein's brain was 35% more connections than that. So it's the connections, the number of connections, how many cells are talking to each other, which forms directly IQ, brain development, intelligence. These neurons firing produce about 25 watts of power. That's enough for a light bulb. It's sort of mind-blowing, and the cosmic nature of how the brain connections and the axon connections look like the connections in extragalactic patterns in the cosmos has scientists questioning over the last few years. Is the cosmos a super universal brain? Because it appears as if galaxies and nebula connected through these lines of star fields look very similar to brain connections, and it's possible that it's all a fractal projection back and forth, outwards and inwards. The brain, the universe itself might be a big brain. We may be some small little particle inside of an atom of a neuron of a larger brain in the universe, where all of it is connected together. You, me, my body, the cosmos, so closely intertwined together that my next thought eventually has an effect on the entire web in the universe. And of course, that's precisely what quantum physics is showing us to be true, that the quantum field extends everywhere. And if it's infinite, it means I'm always in the middle of that web. And the universe goes to the same place. Deepak Chopra said this once. The universe goes to the same place to create a galactic star pattern or a nebula or a planet or an ecosystem or a person. It goes to the same place to do that as it does for my next thought. Because it's all one thing. It's like my thought is part of the network of that. That everything in the universe is part of the body of the universe, including me and my thoughts and my emotions. And every single one of those things that happens creates a ripple pattern that extends out into everywhere. One thing leads to the other. That ripple pattern affects everything eventually. The butterfly wing goes up or down, and the whole universe changes, depending on which one it is. And of course, in quantum physics, there's a possibility that whether the butterfly wing is going to go up or down to change everything actually splits the universe into two parallel corridors with an up wing and a down wing, and they both carry forward. That the universe is multifaceted, that is an infinite number of parallel corridors of the universe playing out every possibility that could ever be. All of them simultaneously happening to explore every story possible in the mind of God, so to speak. But with that being said, it's time for us to put our headphones on. And today, again, this is another one of those sort of deep meditative soundtracks, sort of a reorganization soundtrack for the whole neural field, based on the awakened mind pattern that was picked up on EEG from C. Maxwell Cade, who is taking his portable EEG machine around the mind mirror to all over the world looking for enlightenment, looking to hook up all kinds of different meditators and swamis and gurus to see what the brain picture of awakened mind looks like, of enlightenment. And he saw this pattern that showed up so often. He called it the awakened mind and wrote a book about it. 15 different levels of brain activity from beta down to delta, all synchronized between the right and left hemispheres with the maximum amplitudes in theta and alpha. And I reproduced that as 15 layers of binaural beats mixed in a soundtrack to entrain the brainwaves to that awakened mind pattern. And that's the basis of this soundtrack. But it's a sort of a musical sound space. It's really one of those good meditative soundtracks that doesn't have Western rules of music that's taking it anywhere except from here. That music's going no place but here. So let yourself go. Put your headphones on. And close your eyes, and here we go. this is where you can get that soundtrack today. It's good to be back on Sunday. We'll continue down this sort of crazy path, and it gets a little more weird and weird all the time. But next week we'll continue on this idea of all the different pathways that this esoteric anatomy idea could go. So thank you for following me back here to Sunday. Thank you all for being here. Take care of yourselves. It's still a global pandemic. Things are getting better. Thank you all